Hi everyone, so today we're going to be looking at cultural variations in attachment. This follows on from your work on the strange situation on Ainsworth, so you need to make sure that you're confident and comfortable with explaining Ainsworth's research, explaining what the three types of attachment are, and explaining the process of the strange situation. If you're not, make sure you go and look at that first before moving on to this topic. So we're going to be looking at describing two particular studies on cultural variations in attachment. I want you to think about afterwards the strengths and the weaknesses as we go through this, and then thinking about analysing cultural variations. So, what's the difference between these two pictures? What is culture, and how do these two pictures represent individualist and collectivist cultures? And what are the differences between these types of cultures? So hopefully you should recognise that a culture is a set of norms or traditions or beliefs that are shared by a large group of people. And there are two types of cultures that we distinguish between in psychology, which are individualist and collectivist, which you should be familiar with. Individualist is the picture on the left-hand side, and it represents people who are particularly focused on independence and individuality, whereas collectivist cultures are more focused on emphasising group membership and interdependence. So you need to know what each of those key terms mean, and you need to be confident in explaining them. So I've gone through culture, individualist and collectivist, but I'll also go through cultural variations. And cultural variations are the differences in norms and values that exist between different groups of people. So how do cultures differ from each other? How is an individualist culture different from a collectivist culture? Something to bear in mind as an evaluation point, and next year when you go on and do issues and debates, is looking at cultural bias. So by distinguishing and saying that these cultures are different from each other, is that in fact a negative thing? And maybe they're more similar than they first seem. So we should always be careful when we're trying to divide these different cultures up, because actually there's a lot more variation between individual countries than there is often between cultures or within a country. So bear that in mind as we go through. There are some basic differences between the two types of culture. Collectivist cultures emphasise group effort. It's all about the group working together in order for group success, and this is because they value and believe that their culture is, and their family or their group or society will help each other to succeed. And that's important because if someone in your group succeeds, then that means your whole group succeeds, and therefore there tends to be less antisocial behaviour. And these can be, as an example, China or Japan, which we're going to look at in today's lesson. Individualist cultures, on the other hand, are all about your personal achievement and about your individual success. So if you succeed at something, it's for the benefit of you and you alone. And therefore there tends to be more antisocial behaviour. And this is the UK or Germany or the USA as examples, but not limited to. So we're going to look today about how might attachment differ across these cultures. So how is the attachment different in different cultures? So the main study that you need to look at is Van Lizendoorn and Kroonenberg, 1988. Now this is a study is slightly different because it's actually a meta-analysis, which means that they didn't collect the data themselves, so it is secondary data. In fact, what they did was they collected a lot of different studies from other people and analysed the results of them. And the reason why they were doing this was to look at the different types of attachments and whether there was a variation in the different types of attachments between the different countries. Remember, if you're thinking about evaluating this, what are the negatives of secondary data, i.e. data that you didn't collect yourself? And also, what are the positives of a meta-analysis? How is it positive to collect lots of data about a topic? So the procedure was that there were 32 studies that they collected and analysed, and all the studies used the strange situation procedure. Now this is important again because it's showing the consistency each study is using the same procedure, so that when we analyse the data, that is making the data more valid and also more reliable, because there is a consistent procedure throughout. Now, there were 2,000 participants used across those 32 studies, and they were from over 8 different countries. So what you should think about is, which types of attachment do we think will be most common? Thinking back to what we found out in the Strange Situation and Ainsworth's study, which countries will show more secure attachment, do you think, between individualist or collectivist? And why are some cultures going to show more of one than the other? Think back to what we know about collectivist and individualist cultures. So, the findings. They found similarities between all the cultures, in that all cultures had secure attachment as the highest proportion. So all cultures had secure attachment as the main attachment type in the country, although it did vary between what percentage that was. Great Britain was the highest percentage of secure attachment types. They also found a high proportion of avoidant in individualist cultures, where, for example, in West Germany, where they tend to let their children go out into the world and explore more. They're quite lenient on how much they allow them to explore. Whereas the high proportion of resistant attachment types were found in collectivist cultures such as Japan. And in Japan, there's a real tradition that you carry your baby round with you at all times. So mothers have those kind of papoose sling things. And the baby is, a good parent is a parent who holds the baby close to them at all times. So that's the parenting style that is used there. And they also found differences within the culture. So actually, within a culture, so within Great Britain, for example, or within an individualist culture, there was actually a lot more variation than there was between cultures, thinking about this as an evaluation point as well. For example, in the Japanese studies, they showed no avoidant attachment babies, but in a second study, they found around 20%. So there's a real difference between the studies as well. Therefore, we can conclude that secure attachment seems to be the norm, and therefore Bowlby's idea of attachment being innate and not learned, so you're born with, therefore means that it must be universal. But there are clearly different cultural practices, so how parents are raising their children is definitely different in different countries. For example, individualist cultures bring up their children to be more independent, whereas collectivist cultures are focusing on children supporting their parents, and therefore their parents and their grandparents being dependent on their children. That's the main study that you need to know in detail, but you can also add and support that with extra research. And this is an extra research by Jin et al. 2012. And they conducted a study carrying another meta-analysis, collecting data from just Korea. And they wanted to see whether it was the same in Korea as it had been in other cultures. Now, Korea is a collectivist culture, so we're expecting to find slightly less secure attachment and slightly more to do with insecure resistant. So have a think about how the results similar to those of Van Lizendoorn and Kroonenberg, which countries are the results closest to, and why do you think this is? So they found that the overall proportion of secure attachments and insecure attachments were similar to most other countries, so they were similar across the board. But most children were securely attached, but more were insecure resistant, and that was similar to, or most similar to, those in Japan. And that's because those in Japan and Korea have very similar child rearing styles, so it's likely that child rearing again is having an influence on how children what children's attachments are. Thanks very much.